Hello, geographers. We are going to be discussing Iraq and Iran today. Two places that I feel like kids kind of get confused on and mixed up between the two places. And the United States has a long history with both places, and they do have some similarities, but they also have quite a bit of differences as well. So I wanted to kind of talk about these two countries. We'll probably kind of talk about them, break it up into two different lessons. First of all, they over the years have not really liked each other very much. During the 1980s, they fought a big war against each other. It was a war that the United States was not involved in, but it was Iraq against Iran. Their leaders did not like each other, and so you should know that. Both are members of OPEC. This is the oil producing countries of the world, the big ones to kind of work together. A lot of Middle Eastern countries, but also Venezuela is part of it, Indonesia is part of it, and they kind of control the price of oil a little bit. When they overproduce and oversell, the price tends to drop a little bit. If they cut back on how much they're selling, then the price can rise, and that can affect different things around the world. Close to home, it can affect things like North Dakota. In North Dakota, in Oklahoma, there's a lot of fracking, which is a very expensive kind of drilling for oil. Very expensive way to kind of get it out of the ground. It's not cheap like if it just you get down to the to the reservoir of oil and it explodes out of the ground like you've seen on movies or TV shows. Well, fracking's expensive, and basically, like when the price of oil, a barrel of oil drops really low, they can't make their money back very easily up in North Dakota. So when OPEC tends to control the price of oil, by lowering it, they can affect places like North Dakota. If the price of oil is high because they're cutting back on how much they're selling, then North Dakota becomes profitable. So it certainly can affect a lot of different things. And both Iraq and Iran are part of OPEC going back to 1960 when it founded. You can just kind of see it here. OPEC's share of the world crude oil reserves. Oil reserves are what they believe are still down in the ground. And you can just kind of see a pretty good chunk, the OPEC countries that control this. And then, of course, the countries that have a lot of oil. It's part of OPEC. Venezuela in the orange is a big one. Let's see, where's Saudi Arabia? Purple. That's the biggest. Um, Iran in the green, and Iraq in the dark green. So these are some major players. You just kind of see the gas prices. When I first started driving a car in the year 2000, about $1.50 for a gallon of gas, $3.53 in 2011, and now we're looking at like $1.60, $1.50 for gas right now because of the COVID-19. So if you go to Iraq, they tend to have three large ethnic groups, and this has caused some problems over the years. First, you have the Arab Shia Muslims, who are make up about 60% of the population, and then they're kind of down here in the green is where they live. Well, in Iran, Iran is mostly Shia as well. Then you have 37% are Arab Sunni Muslims, kind of up here in the white area, and they make up kind of that middle ethnic group. And there's been conflict between the Sunnis and the Shia. For instance, you had um, you had Saddam Hussein, the leader that we'll talk about later. He was a Sunni, so you had a minority group in charge of a majority group, which caused conflict. Then up here, they're not Arabs. They don't speak Arabic. They don't act Arabic. They are the Kurds. They're also Muslims, just like the Arabs, but they are a different ethnic group speaking a different language. And they have also been persecuted in Iraq over the years. So you have these three different ethnic groups that don't always get along. Then you hop over the border, and you do not really have any Arabs in Iran. You have Persians. They do not speak Arabic. They do not. They do not act Arabic. They have a whole different religion. They are Persian, and they are mostly Shia. So you have your Shia in Iraq, and you have your majority of people in Iran are Shia. And so sometimes this causes a conflict where you have Iran pumping money into this group, and you have Saudi Arabia pumping money into the Sunnis, and those two having conflicts against each other. The population of Iran is 80 million. We'll have a video that we'll watch later. Won't really work on here. Tehran is the capital, very modern city. You see here. There's Tehran. This is the Azadi Tower, Freedom Tower, basically, a monument that went up as they kind of overthrew their government that they thought was a puppet-ran government by the United States. Here's a mall. Now you flip over to Iraq. Iraq is much smaller than Iran. It has 31 million people as opposed to 80 million. Here's Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. Maybe not quite as modern a city as Tehran, or maybe not quite as new infrastructure or as nice infrastructure, but still a modern city. If you go to Iraq, they have two official languages, Arabic and Kurdish. If you go to Iran, they have Farsi, which is a Persian language. Iraqi cuisine, which we'll see a video later, their main dishes are a combination of rice with meat, vegetables, nuts. Herbs are usually used to kind of spice everything up a little bit. Fruits, plums, pomegranates, prunes, apricots, raisins. So this might be a typical meal that you would see. Kind of see like a stew here. Had a video of Anthony Bourdain in Iran that we'll see later. So this was Iranian food, and here's Iraqi cuisine. Same, similar in that you are going to see a lot of nuts, a lot of dried fruits. This is kind of a traditional meal where you have these vine leaves. It's called dolma, and you have these vine leaves stuffed with meats and spices and rice. Kebabs. When you hear about like shish kebabs or you make kebabs on the grill, that came from this part of the world. Falafels, where you have the fried hummus, and everybody kind of has a different falafel recipe and hummus recipe. Just like maybe here everybody has a little bit different tater tot hot dish recipe. Pita bread. So here's hummus. Some of you like hummus. Now the United States, we've had a history with both countries. So take a look. Here's Iraq, 30 million people. Here's Iran, 80 million people. Now, one of the things where we're talking about getting into a war with Iran, we've never been in a war with Iran. We've been in a couple of conflicts now with Iraq, and some differences here. Look how much bigger Iran is than Iraq. That can pose some issues if we were to get into a war with Iran. Iran also has a navy. Iraq really did not have a navy, so that can also pose some issues, and just having another 50 million people there. The first time we really have an issue with Iran, so here's Iran, was back in the 1950s. This is Cold War era time, and we were not real happy that Iran, after World War II, was becoming a democracy, and they had elected a prime minister who wanted to nationalize the oil fields. So instead of basically selling this oil to the United States and Great Britain, they were talking about, hey, we're going to open it up and we're going to sell it to whoever we want. And so we were worried because they were going to probably sell it to the highest bidder, which is how capitalism works, and they were going to sell it to the Soviet Union, which we did not want because it was Cold War. We're trying to win the Cold War. And so we decide we're going to help, the CIA is going to help with a coup and overthrow the democratically elected prime minister and basically put the king, the Shah, back in charge. and they call that Operation Ajax, where that happened. So the prime minister is arrested. The Shah, you see here, is put back in charge, and basically, even though you would think we would like a democratically elected prime minister because we support democracy, we decide the lesser of two evils is having a king that's going to rule. There he is. The problem was he was kind of a brutal dictator, and he killed and imprisoned and suppressed people that disagreed with him, but at least he wasn't selling the oil to communists. A couple decades later, there is a revolution, and the Shah is overthrown, and the government is then taken over by Islamic leaders. And they kind of set up a democracy after this, but it's really a theocracy where the religious leaders tell the elected officials what to do. Now, during the overthrow of the government, a group of college students, they are going to basically take over and attack the U.S. Embassy. People were mad because the United States let the Shah in to receive medical treatment. He was fighting cancer at the time. And so our embassy is overtaken, and they take 52 Americans hostage. And they are taken hostage for over 444 days. And that is the Iranian hostage crisis. This was the guy that took over. Ruhollah Khomeini. Can't say it very good. Anyway, he becomes the Ayatollah, and he doesn't look like a very good guy. And you kind of say, well, sometimes you get what you wish for or whatever. Well, when they overthrew the Shah, and he was a brutal dictator who killed and imprisoned and suppressed his people, well, they got kind of a worse version of that, because the Ayatollah also arrested and threw people in jail and murdered people that disagreed with him. And so it maybe got even worse under him. But the government now is being run as a theocracy. So they are going to elect a president, they are going to elect a Congress and a prime minister and everything. But even though those people are going to make a lot of the day-to-day decisions, they still have to follow the orders of the religious leaders. So theocracy is a government ran by religious leaders. This is a pretty big country to be run by religious leaders. You think about like Vatican City in Rome. Vatican City is a very small country. Only hundreds of people live there. Who's in charge there? The Pope. That's also a theocracy. They also painted a lot of murals. Here's a mural on the U.S. Embassy. And people have said, boy, these murals always look really good. Well, tourists that go to Iran always want to have their picture taken with these murals. So every few years, they hire artists to come in and kind of touch up the paint and make it look good. So tourists will keep wanting to get their pictures taken by these things. Here's some protesters. Looks like they're burning the American flag. Notice these other flags they're stomping on here. We all recognize the U.S. flag, Great Britain's flag. Probably recognize this as Israel's flag. And here's the one you may not recognize, and that is Saudi Arabia's flag. Remember, the Saudis are Sunni, and the Iranians are Shia, and so they don't always get along. Now, recently we've had some issues with Iran with their nuclear program. They've been working on building nuclear bombs, other things to deal with nuclear stuff. And so here's their former president. He passed away a few years ago, but in this cartoon he says, of course our nuclear facilities are for peaceful purposes. Why do you ask? And what's happening to his nose? It's growing, just like Pinocchio's. And Pinocchio's nose grows when he does what? That's right, when he lies. And the missile says death to America and Israel. And so they're basically in this one, they're saying he is lying. A few years ago, we set up a nuclear deal with Iran where basically they would shut down their programs working on nuclear weapons, and then we would lift sanctions to make it easier for them to trade with other countries. And that was going well until recently. Between both sides, the U.S. said, we're going to put sanctions back on you, and Iran said, okay, we're going to keep working on nuclear weapons. And so we've had some issues with Iran, some issues with we took out one of their generals recently in Iraq, and then they launched some missiles dropped some bombs or something on one of our bases. It hasn't led to war, but we were feeling a little bit like, uh-oh, there might be a war coming on here. Now we'll flip over to Iraq. The first time a lot of Americans probably heard of Iraq was in 1991. We fought a war to drive Iraq out of our allies' countries. Kuwait had been invaded by Iraq, and Iraq had also threatened Saudi Arabia. The United States put together a coalition where we had 35 nations, and we forced Iraq out of Kuwait. The Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, lasted 1 month, 1 week, and 4 days. So it was very quick to accomplish our goals. And so here you can see Kuwait, where we get a lot of oil. We have a military base there today. And we had to drive these forces out. Here's Saudi Arabia, where they allowed us to launch planes and kind of station our troops in the desert. We were able to launch planes from Turkey, Israel, Egypt, Jordan. Maybe not Jordan, but they're our friends. Qatar, Bahrain, we're launching these attacks from there, and we're bombing the oil fields, things like that, but we're driving Iraq army out of Kuwait. This was the dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. When I was a kid in the 90s, he was like public enemy number one. People did not like him. He was made fun of on Saturday Night Live. He was made fun of on South Park. He was like, when I was growing up, the worst person ever imaginable was Hitler. Number two was Saddam Hussein. That's just kind of how he was portrayed. And he was a bad guy. He had killed people. Now, the United States, under the first president, George Bush, is trying to decide if they are going to invade Iraq. And in the end, they decide not to. There's kind of a peace treaty written up, and the U.S. decides not to invade Iraq, but we would put United Nations sanctions on them where they could not make weapons of mass destruction, poisonous gas, and that type of thing. So Saddam gets to stay in power in 1991. He'd been in power for over 10 years at that point, and he gets to stay in power, and we don't invade. Now, here's kind of where there's an issue. When Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, Osama bin Laden who was a native of Saudi Arabia, had said, listen, I have just gotten done fighting with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, driving the Russians out of there. It took 10 years, but we did it. He said, I'll do the same thing to Saddam Hussein. And Saudi Arabia said, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to take up the U.S.'s offer and the United Nations offer, or the coalition, to drive them out. And so Osama bin Laden doesn't like this. He was willing to put together and fight and kill Iraqi soldiers, but the way he viewed it is, hey, I'm a Muslim, and other Muslims that live here will fight and kill other Muslims. He did not like it that the United States and the Western countries were going to be killing Muslims in the Holy Land. Remember, Mecca and Medina are the two holiest cities. So at this point, Al-Qaeda had been started, and he decides to leave Saudi Arabia and go back to Afghanistan, where he had friends. And this is where he kind of uses Afghanistan as a base of operations, angry at the Saudi government and angry at the United States and other Western nations. He kind of looks at it as the Crusades all over again. Christian Westerners coming to kill Muslims, Arabic Muslims in the Middle East, and he doesn't like that. And so this is where he really ramps up Al-Qaeda. And he was a guy that he did not like Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden did not like Saddam Hussein. And so these two guys don't get along. A lot of times people mix them up, and they are very different from each other. This is going to lead to 9/11. Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda organize a terrorist attack. So this is about 10 years after the Iraqi war. And in this attack, 4 airplanes are hijacked. They hit 3 targets. The Twin Towers in New York, plane hits both of those, and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., that is the head of our military operations. The 4th plane was either heading for the White House or the Capitol building, but the passengers on the plane had been getting cell phone calls and knew, or some of them had, and they knew what was happening, and they try to take the plane back, and it crashes in that Pennsylvania farm field. And that's why we went to war in Afghanistan, because that's where Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda had been hiding out. The leaders of Afghanistan were called the Taliban. And we said, hey, Taliban, hand them over. And they said no. And that's when we went to war in Afghanistan and started the war on terror. So you can link it back to that 1991 Gulf War. Right around the same time, basically after 9/11, Saddam Hussein in Iraq says, I'm not going to let the United Nations investigators look at my factories anymore. He kind of thought that he could do that and we wouldn't go to war with them because we were already fighting a war in Afghanistan. Well, we call his bluff and we say we're going to fight 2 wars at once. And so when he stops letting those inspectors look in those factories, that's when we declare war on Iraq, that he might be making weapons of mass destruction. And once again, it's fairly easy to defeat Saddam's forces, his soldiers. We capture Saddam, and when they have a new elected government, this one dominated by the Shia, they decide to execute Saddam, and he's hanged to death. The problem is Al-Qaeda started moving into Iraq, and they started to get some of the Sunnis that used to be in charge and used to be part of the army, and they started to join up with Al-Qaeda, and they were fighting U.S. soldiers. They were fighting Shia military groups. The U.S. is kind of caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace there. And so even though we defeated the army of Iraq, it's now difficult to keep it a safe place and create a democracy out of it, which was our goal. And this Al-Qaeda group that had moved into Iraq created a new group called the Islamic State. And so some of these former members of Al-Qaeda merge and create the Islamic State, ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, also called ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and sometimes just called the Islamic State. And their goal was to create a new caliphate, which we've talked about before. And pretty much the main forces of ISIS today in 2020 have been defeated. The problem is that idea still lives in some brains. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that next time.